All right, let's go ahead and get started as folks are still rolling in. So I'd like to thank everybody for joining us for the fifth webinar of the 2025 Forest and Climate Learning Exchange Series, where this year we're having six dialogue panels related to the integrity of forest carbon offsets. So today's we're talking about kind of market investments related to the forest economy. But before we get into that, um, I'd like to first thank our co-host for the webinar series. So the 2025 Forest and Climate Learning Exchange Series is co-hosted by the Society of American Foresters, which is a national scientific and educational organization representing forestry and related natural resource professionals across the United States, founded in 1900. SAF promotes science-based sustainable management and stewardship of the nation's public and private forests. We're also joined by Pennsylvania State University Extension, and the FOSSE program, the Forest Owner Carbon and Climate Education Program. So this year's Learning Exchange Series is hosted by myself, Dr. Chad Papa. I'm the director of the Forest Carbon and Climate Program here at Michigan State University, as well as Dr. Melissa Cry with Pennsylvania State University. Before we get going today, I do want to highlight our next upcoming webinar, our sixth and final one on June 17th from 2 to 3 p.m. You can scan the QR code on your screen right now, which will take you to a registration page. But this is the social and ecological impacts of forest carbon offsets. So we'll be joined by Tatiana Ruseva from Appalachia State University, Stephanie Chismar from USDA Forest Service Research and Development, and Jake Stanton from the National Indian Carbon Coalition. And this panel will be moderated by Melissa Cry, who's on the call today as well. This webinar is also attendees of this webinar are also able to earn continuing education credits through both Society of American Foresters, SAF, as well as the International Society of Arboriculture, ISA. If you registered for this webinar with the same email as your SAF account, the credits will automatically be applied to your account. If not, please email and contact SAF at cf@safnet.org. And then if you are seeking ISA CEUs, please email forestc@msu.edu and we will submit your email and contact for credit approval. Last thing to cover is at the end of this webinar panel, we'll have a Q&A session. And so there are two ways for folks to enter in questions for that portion. And we please encourage you to enter questions at any point during the panel. We have the Q&A function enabled at the bottom of your screen. You're able to submit questions both anonymously or with your name. And then the chat function is also enabled where you can send messages directly to the panelists. And we will do our best to address all relevant questions. Last thing to note is please join our mailing list. So scan the QR code on the screen, and that will take you to the mailing list for the Forest Carbon and Climate Program to stay up to date on news and events and research related to forest carbon and climate. And so with that, I'm going to hand off the panel today to our moderator, Melissa Cry.
Thank you so much, Chad. I'm really excited to have this panel today. I think it's going to be a really great discussion. This is a large topic, and so what we've done is we've invited folks that kind of represent the different, maybe different viewpoints of the different sectors of the forest economy to come and present. And so I thank you very much. We have Tammy Kalawaski and Dave McAvoy from Appalachia State University, Tammy Cushing from University of Florida, and Raju Pokaral from Michigan State University. And I just really appreciate all of you being here. I apologize if you hear construction going on while I present. I will try and mute when I can. But to help kick off this discussion, I thought we would grease the wheels and I would share a little bit just to sort of help help us understand, what is this bioeconomy? Who's involved? And so for today's discussion, we're looking at, the views of forest owners, offset buyers, the forest industry, and any the governing bodies. So there's registries, but more specifically looking at policy level governance regarding carbon markets. And so I think it'll bring a really good sort of multiple perspectives to this complicated space. First, just want to, kind of help clarify, who owns forest land in the United States. That's where most of our subject matter is going to be focused on, is here in the US. But, of course, our forests and carbon expand to the international scope. And I just want to point out a few things here. I only have like 5 minutes for this overview. And that is when it comes to where forest carbon offsets are currently located, it is not a majority is not on federal lands, not on state managed lands, although that's starting to happen a little bit like in Minnesota. It's starting on tribal lands. And it, of course, as you know, it's getting going on family forest lands or non-industrial forest lands, but most of it is in those corporately held lands. So those TIMOs and REITs, those timber management lands where, Weyerhaeuser and Rayonier, they are engaged in carbon offsets. And so, there's a question of, where is our timber coming from if they're managing for carbon and timber? And so most of our timber right now and historically has come from non-industrial forest lands, over 58% in the US. When we talk about the wood products, forest products industry, it is a very large industry in the US. It's about total contribution to our economy is about 300 billion annually, supports over 2.5 million jobs in our country. We we import more than we export. There's a $23.7 billion deficit. And so there's a lot of factors why we import wood. And I won't go into all of them, but I will say historically there has been a slowdown in harvesting on non-industrial private lands. And so that is something that is happening at the same time. When it comes to carbon stocks, you can see the overlay of carbon stocks is right there where the forests are, right where the forest industry is. And of course, roughly on average, about half of carbon stocks are in the trees above ground where it can be managed, through forest management. Research has shown that, we have increasingly more dense stands of forest. We have more trees per acre than historically. And also, as I mentioned, there's slowdowns in harvesting, and that slowdown in harvesting has led to about a 16% reduction in emissions per year, up to 16%, just through slowdowns in harvesting. So our forests are already offsetting our carbon footprint in the US, but it's not through any sort of incentivization mechanism. So what are the carbon offset projects? So this is from the Berkeley Carbon Trading Project, who's keeping track of what kinds of projects are in the U.S. And the major categories include afforestation and reforestation and avoided conversion. And those are pretty standard styles of projects in the global South. But here in the U.S., 88% are something called improved forest management, which is basically taking mature trees and that are ready for harvest and then extending that harvest rotation. And so we are a really good fit for that in the United States because we have strong private property rights around trees. We have established management practices. And then we also have a lot of mature forests at a harvestable age. And so the idea of getting a little bit more carbon onto the landscape is something that's accessible. And it also, it is pretty efficient to do when you're basically extending a harvest rotation is doesn't require too many changes other than a change in decision making. I want to talk a little bit about the difference between compliance markets and voluntary markets. The compliance market, it says enrollment there, but actually it's more like participants. Participants in compliance markets, those buyers are generally mandated to be involved. And so that would be in states that have these compliance requirements, usually focus on industries that are generating most of the carbon emissions generally related to energy production. The voluntary market largely caters to corporations and organizations that are interested in voluntarily reducing their carbon footprint. And Tammy Kay is going to talk a little bit more about why they may want to do that voluntarily. The commitments tend to be a little different on either market. So the compliance market is considered to have more robust standards about what qualifies as a carbon credit under compliance markets, whereas the voluntary market, it can range widely, but even have shorter contracts. In terms of the standards of the basic industry standards of real additionality, permanence, and non-leakage, that's the same in both markets. Whether or not the protocols that are being used are considered the same, is it's actually really different. In the compliance market, the requirements for meeting those standards is quite high. Where in the voluntary market, folks can generate and sell carbon credits without even needing oversight from a registry. It's voluntary. It can be just two people making an agreement. However, the value of those credits are not very high, so there is an incentive to use protocols that are from approved registries. And then, but as I said, they all go through the similar stages of development and developing these offsets, and the verification process is similar. The market size across these markets is quite a bit different. And so in the compliance market globally, it's reached about 851 billion, where on the voluntary market, it's really reached about 2 billion. When we break that down to last year, the California market, which is a compliance market, did about 28 billion in sales total, or no, sorry, total in since 2013, where the voluntary market did about 9 million in 2023. So we're talking differences of billions versus millions. However, the voluntary market's been projected to go up considerably up into the billions in the next 30 or 40 years. This is just a figure showing where those compliance markets are operating. You can see it is just in a few states. It's more common outside the U.S. So the voluntary market is pretty much a big player in the United States, and it's where a lot of carbon offsets that are working with family forest-owned lands are located right now. And then this is my last slide. And it's just saying, what's the future of forest and carbon offsets? This is a figure by the Climate Impact Partners that's basically showing under their survey of Fortune 500 companies when they expect to achieve carbon neutrality. And so 33% are looking to achieve carbon neutrality, in the next 30 years. And the reason for this is that they expect to basically use more energy. They're investing in technologies such as AI, which is very energy intensive. And you can't basically use technology to reduce your carbon footprint at some point because of the way that AI uses energy. So they're going to have to be offsetting in some way. And so the question is, will forest lands be part of those offsets in the future? Let's see, I think that is getting to my last slide here. So previously on this webinar series, we've been focused more on how do we ensure that a carbon credit is robust and legitimate. And so this idea of taking what used to be a public good of regulating climate through forest management and turning it into a private good that can be traded is rather complicated. So please look at our previous webinars for that. Today, we're going to look more at the market dynamics and then those positive and negative externalities, those positive and negative impacts of bringing a carbon market into the forest industry space, and what is the will of stakeholders within this market to make that happen. That's really the focus of today's conversation. So I think we've got a pretty good sense of where we're going and what we're going to be talking about. So now we have each of our panelists are going to have like a 3 or 4 minute just sort of overview of the area that they work in and some of the things they're seeing, and then we will get into the discussion. So I'll kick it off by handing it off to Dave.
Thank you very much. I'm hoping I'm sharing this appropriately. I see some head nods,
Yep.
so that's a good sign. Uh, Thank you for the invitation. I'm happy to join the panel. Like Melissa said, I'm a professor of economics at Appalachian State University, and I focus research and teaching on environmental policy, the economics of environmental policies. And much of my research and teaching is actually focused on the international side, and so that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about in the next few minutes is that linkage between what happens globally to domestic policies and markets and the carbon markets in the US. Um, and in particular, I want to focus on what's called Article 6.4 of the Paris Agreement, the current, global governance agreement we have under the UNFCCC. 6.4 is an important article. It's been an article of debate since Paris was drafted. And this is the international kind of trading of emissions reductions or emissions responsibilities more generally. And and in the last two COPs, Conference of the Parties, that's where countries get together to annually to to work these things out. And the focus of, or a large focus in the last few have been on this mechanism, which is called the Paris, or ultimately now called the Paris Agreement Crediting Mechanism, PACM. And this is a centralized international emissions reductions trading system.
Oh, Dave, real quick, there's like a
Yeah.
pop-up window on the screen.
Oh,
Yeah,
continue to
right here.
share. Sorry,
Perfect.
thank
Thank
you.
you.
And so the overarching objective is to kind of increase the ambition. So countries are more willing to take on emissions abatement responsibilities because the cost could potentially be reduced through trading. And this is a kind of an old economic concept. It's this concept that underpins all cap and trade. Um, and there are some strong similarities between this and a permit market like cap and trade. But the idea is that the sellers are kind of implementing emissions reduction projects. You could think of forest owners in the US or elsewhere, earning carbon credits for that activity. Um, and those verified credits could be purchased and the buyers could be purchasing for any number of reasons. Melissa's last slide or penultimate slide was showing Fortune 500 companies and their projected targets and goals, and clearly there's demand coming from there. But on kind of policy side, with this kind of global commitments or global targets, the implementation of PACM would certainly open up to a lot more potential buyers. And again, the important part is that the emissions reductions, it's not critical where they're coming from, the point source. The whole idea is that these, greenhouse gases, carbon being the most important in this sense, it doesn't really matter the point source. And so if these are verified and if these are legitimate credits, then they get decoupled from the project. And so you're just buying a 1 metric ton emissions reduction, for instance. And so this kind of stream of events is really simplified. There are so many details and pages of documentation under PAC-M, but the idea is that a project is proposed. It could be proposed at a government level. It could be proposed at a landowner level. It could be proposed by an owner that's part of a country that's not a signatory to the Paris Agreement. So there's all kinds of flexibility in who could propose a project. There's all kinds of remaining uncertainty on the body that verifies and kind of stamps of approval. That's called the supervisory body. That's that second point in the sequence of events, the registration. There's all kinds of monitoring, reporting, verification, on-ground verification that's important to this. But the idea is at the very end there, these credits get issued and the credits are decoupled from specific projects. And that's important in any emissions trading or emissions reduction trading scheme or system. So some of the things that could come on the economic side, right? If you're thinking about what are the economics of opening up a global emissions trading system, and that's a lot of demand. I mean, on the demand side, you can imagine that an increased demand for forest carbon credits. Um, Now, some of these bullet points are kind of considering a world where everything else is remaining the same, or ceteris paribus, as we say in econ, but the pressure for from an international increase in demand for carbon credits, of course, would have an upward pressure on prices. Um, Melissa mentioned the link between voluntary and compliance markets, and depending on how all of this plays out, uh, it's very possible, like California to some extent now, if there are, and we know that there are more uh, trading systems that exist outside of the United States, at least, that if these are kind of high quality offsets or projects that meet these standards, that it could move voluntary to compliance. And for the most part, compliance um, permits, credits fetch a higher price for various economic reasons. But that could lead to differentiated products if you can imagine a carbon, an afforestation, let's say, project that meets the standards of PAC-M, puts it at kind of differentiates it from other current standards. Could lead to more investor confidence and financial flows, boosts to a lot of rural areas that would have forest owners. Um, there are other sides too. I mean, I think to tap into this market, like I said, there's a lot of uncertainty. It's going to require a lot more monitoring, verification, third party, um, learning curves. I'm sure there's going to be a bridge that's needed from what's called the supervisory body under the Paris Agreement to private owners. And I'll just leave you with some questions and kind of, I don't know, thoughts that motivate some of my future research, but others I know as well. One of the big concerns with all of this, and this is not just PAC-M, is additionality and permanence. Um, I think PAC-M has set a really high, still uncertain standard for some of these things that are going to ultimately decide how um, realistic it is to tap into these projects or try to get certified. Whether the United States aligns some of its voluntary and compliance, regulations, oversights on its carbon markets with PAC-M standards is going to be very important. You can imagine uh, a cooperative government really moving in that direction and making it easier for all parties to get involved. How easily it is for private owners to submit to this body under the Paris Agreement. A big concern, our previous international agreement governing climate change, the Kyoto Protocol, or the one that preceded, sorry, the Paris Agreement. The clean development mechanism was exactly this idea of, trading emissions responsibilities to capture some of these cost reduction gains. And for all kinds of reasons, this started off as a disaster. And the hope is that our experience with that doesn't poison the well for potential, gains in all kinds of aspects from a well-functioning market. I mentioned this third-party verification and what are those institutions, especially here in the United States. Timeline, things take a long time. If we're about to start November COP30, and if you're following all these aspects of international negotiations, it's not quick, and so we're still waiting for some final guidelines for standards and processes. And of course, on the supply side, what's going to happen in terms of carbon credits, not just, forest owners in the United States, but this is a global market. And so where are they going to come from, and what are the kind of the quality of those credits on the market? So anyway, I thank you for the time, and I'll stop there.
Great, thank you, Dave. I think things keep moving forward. Nothing slows down, even though you don't hear anything for a while. So it's really great to get caught up on the news on terms of new vision about how we can create a more robust market and potentially enhance the development of carbon offsets. I'm sure the buyers are interested, right, Tammy? So I'd love to hear about your work on that side, looking at buyers' views of these offsets.
Well, again, I echo Dave's sentiment. Thanks so much for having me. It's been great to be involved in this work. As a business professor, I don't think, and particularly accounting background, no, we're not always thought of as being able to have a whole lot of knowledge in this space, but I've been really fortunate to have been able to work with some folks here at Appalachian State University, and I've been in part of a very interdisciplinary group. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and see if that works. Oops, I need to, sorry about that. Let me share first. Okay. Is that coming up?
It is. I see your name.
Great. And let me know if there's some pop-up box that I'm not aware of. I don't see anything other than this first part. So my name is Tammy Kowalczyk. I'm a professor of accounting and sustainable business at Appalachian State. Been here for over 20 years. I've had the great pleasure of working with some folks in an interdisciplinary space around, particularly around forest carbon projects. And our primary focus for this research has been on how to increase participation, particularly among small private landowners in forest carbon markets. From the map that Melissa showed, you could see that in the southeast, there is a significant amount, over 85% probably of forests at least, are owned by smaller private forest landowners who, until more recently, with some of the projects that have been directed at these particular landowners, haven't really been able to participate in the carbon market space. And so my work, in terms of being involved with this group, has been primarily focused on how can we increase funding and financing sort of at the beginning part so that small private landowners can participate without being burdened too much by the entry costs into these markets. And so given my background, particularly working with corporate reporting, sustainability reporting, and disclosure requirements and how carbon footprints play a role or are a part of this reporting process, that's where my work has gone mostly. So my interest really has been in terms of driving the research I've been involved with is really focusing on what are the drivers for corporate investment in particularly nature-based solutions and special emphasis on forest carbon markets. And so I'm just going to list a few things that I've worked with and that are sort of driving this buyer side perspective on investing in either investing by purchasing forest carbon offsets or by actually investing in the projects directly, nature-based solutions. And so some of the things that have happened in recent years in particular have been some mandatory requirements for reporting around climate, climate-related financial disclosure. This has been led predominantly by the EU in terms of their corporate sustainability reporting directive that they recently issued last couple years. That's online now, and a lot of companies are starting to have to comply with that. And what that means is there's an awful lot of US companies that are also having to comply with that because they are somehow either a parent or subsidiary or some other connection with an EU company that is subjected to this compliance requirement. So that is driving disclosure of not only risks related to climate, but also carbon footprints. And so companies are setting targets and talking about how they are trying to reach those targets. You showed the graph of 33% trying to be zero, carbon zero neutral by 2050. So all companies are setting these targets, and now they're being sort of held to account by these climate disclosure requirements. There's other incentives that have come into play recently around carbon offset strategies. I'm really calling them carbon removal strategies, even though they do end up generating credits for purchase. One of the things that recently came about was carbon recapture equipment, which I think one of the most interesting things about this is that tax exempt entities can also apply for a credit, a tax credit. So they can spend the money and they get a refundable credit even though they don't actually have to file a tax return. So that's kind of a cool thing. The difficulty with this particular strategy, though, is it's not very high volume in terms of what it can sequester and remove. And so it's a great strategy. But I think my personal feeling is that there should be some sort of consideration and extension of something like this to forest carbon projects because they're basically doing the same thing. But we know what the difficulties are with measuring carbon offsets related to forest carbon, and I think that's why they're not dipping their toes in those waters yet. Um, Another thing that is really emerging is nature-related financial risk disclosure, and this is focused on this concept of biodiversity risk. With the extreme attention recently on climate and climate-related risk and financial and the demonization in a lot of ways of the word climate, I think what we're seeing now, this is just my personal view on this, but having been around a lot of business conferences recently, the focus is on really companies beginning to recognize how they need to be accountable for not just carbon and climate impacts, but also other impacts beyond carbon, including biodiversity and the impact on the bioeconomy related to that. A lot of companies are concerned about their supply chains, and they're focused on this idea of nature-based solutions as sort of an insurance policy against some of the effects from nature. And we're seeing that too. I think a little bit that's manifesting itself in a lot of ways with some of the disasters that have occurred recently. We are sort of at the epicenter of Hurricane Helene. And so there is an enormous amount of discussion right now about not just nature-based solution and carbon projects, but also projects around building resilience of natural resources from the business standpoint. So there's a renewed interest in that. And then, of course, ESG ratings and have always been what's been driving sustainability reporting and climate mitigation strategies. And this whole idea of storytelling, which I'm hesitant to even say that word in sort of a business environment because we don't want to think that the stories that are being told aren't true. But nonetheless, companies are very interested in telling their sustainability journey, I guess, is what I'm getting at. And so this is just a little infographic about what are the corporate and industrial buyer side preferences for forest carbon, in particular, forest carbon offsets or forest carbon projects. And the benefits have a lot to do with this idea that it's not just about the co-benefits that also come from forest carbon projects, but also this idea of what they can say about how there is assistance, particularly with rural communities and the economic development in rural communities, and in particular those that have been hurt in some ways by either disaster or honestly also the loss of industries that have sort of become the sin industry. So in this part of the world, in the Appalachian area, we've lost, the coal industry has been something, and the tobacco industry has been something that, has been a big part of this community and these communities for a while. And so the emphasis is on thinking about how can these people that have these natural resource assets, which is a big part of their wealth, how can these be used in a better way? And so companies are interested in trying to build their brand and reputation in focusing on that. And it's also a part of their net zero alignment. And then the concerns about this, of course, go back to what you've already talked about before, meeting these requirements around additionality and permanence. And in particular with permanence with small private forest landowners, this is a tough one because a lot of them are not as interested in keeping their property in projects necessarily for a very long time. So that's problematic from that standpoint. Where I see some knowledge gaps in terms of finding out more and questions we can answer, we still haven't really, even though we've done surveys and really worked a lot in this space, there's still a lot of questions about how to remove these participation barriers for small forest landowners. Been a lot of really great things that are happening in this space. I'm excited about it. But I think what we still need to try to connect is how do we incentivize companies, large companies, to invest and participate in this. There's some other outcomes of forest carbon projects. And so the idea has been thinking about how can we value these outcomes so that companies will be more interested in not only being able to claim carbon credits, but also being able to claim biodiversity credits and other outcomes that they are responsible for, or at least assisting with. And then finally, some new environmental disclosure standards, particularly around nature. How will this affect the propensity to invest more in forest carbon offsets versus other types of credits? And that's it for me. I don't know if I made it within my time limit, but
Awesome. Thank you. That's a great overview. I saw you had an AI generated figure there. So do you have your carbon offset for that? Oh,
yeah,
well,
I've been dabbling with that a little
yeah,
bit.
you gotta figure out what is this AI stuff.
Right.
Okay, well, we're gonna transition over to Raju, who's gonna like focus a little bit more on the existing forest industry and sort of where those intersections may exist between carbon and timber production. Thank you, Raju, for taking part today.
Thank you. Do you see?
It's not in presentation mode.
Oh yeah, I have the same problem again. So let me try one more time. Yeah, I think I got it now.
Looks
Hi,
good.
hi everyone. My name is Raju Pokhrel. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Forestry at Michigan State University. I teach forest economics and forest management here. Most of my work is related with wood product supply chain, and management of forest for nature-based solutions, especially managing forests for carbon and harvested wood products. Um, so today, basically, I want to talk about the study we recently completed for the state of Pennsylvania and Maryland, where we looked at economic trade-off of alternative forest management activities to enhance carbon sequestration efforts. Um, So when we talk about forest carbon management, this is nothing new, although there have been a lot of terms: climate smart forestry, carbon stewardship, adaptive management, adaptive silviculture. All of them reflects to the same thing. It's just one management goal among other goals, and it can be done alongside other management activities as well. So optimizing carbon means balancing climate trade-off with other traditional management goals in the context of ecosystem integrity and climate adaptation. So it's not new. It's old. It's just that we are now focusing on forest sequestering more carbon while managing our forests for forest health, resilience, and wood products. So this study was done by, there's a paper published by Chad Papa. You can, I think he's going to put that in text. So we use the output from that paper where they model different management scenarios to look at how does that affects the forest carbon as well as wood products going forward until 2100. So you can read about this in the paper here, and it should be the link should be in the chat. And then we use that output and looked at the economics. To do that, we use different data sources and looked at the traditional where the products were coming from and how they were being utilized in both states, and created the ratios for different created the ratios between softwood and hardwood inputs, and basically projected that using TPO data in future to project harvested wood product in future until 2100. And then we basically calculated net present value of all the revenues generated from growing trees with all the costs that occur in managing forests for different alternative managements to enhance carbon sequestration efforts in the forest. So we got the stumpage price from state agencies, management costs were used from EQIP database, and then carbon price. We took it from live carbon price today. The price was around $8.29 in 2022. If you look at it today, it is like maybe 30 cents, maybe less. It has crashed, but but that's what we use. So we basically looked at 16 different scenarios and compared it with the baseline. Baseline is the scenario which represents continuation of current management practice. If we change those current management practice to manage forest for better carbon sequestration, which could be different extended rotation, which I'm calling here altered rotations, and then afforestations. We had 4 afforestation scenarios, restocking. We had reduced deforestation as well as to management of active forest management through timber stand improvement and reduced diameter limit cuts, and then some improvement of the forest quality through controlled deer browse, and then silver pasture development, where we were converting some of the pastures into silver pastures in Maryland and Pennsylvania. And we also looked at no harvest activities, what happens if there is no harvest. And then portfolio scenario is combination of all of this other scenarios. So when we did all the math and calculated the net present value, nothing was negative because it was for the whole of the states. However, when we compare it with the baseline scenario, what we see in Maryland is only controlled deer browse when we have less leakage. In carbon was the carbon was paid at $8.29 was positive. Silver pasture has a positive change in the NPV, and then the afforestation, short-term afforestation has positive NPV. But all other scenarios, including reduced diameter limit cut, reduced deforestation, extended rotation, all had negative change in the NPV, meaning that there's a negative economic trade-off for managing this forest through extended rotation or other activities in the state of Maryland, which was a bit different in Pennsylvania, where with the carbon payment and lower leakage, all the afforestation restocking would have better NPV than baseline. Again, here the extended rotation or alter rotation has negative even with carbon payments. Reduced diameter limit cut has a better outcome here because in states like Pennsylvania and even in Maryland, there was a lot of diameter limit cut to target the high value wood in the past. Just changing that behavior would make the forest healthy as well as produce better outcome in long term. Portfolio here again has a negative change, which drops in both cases with carbon payments, but it does not make the change positive over time. So then we looked at the price sensitivity. We looked at the carbon prices, which would make these scenarios at least same as baseline, or you are producing the same NPV as baseline, where extended rotation in Pennsylvania yielded about $70 per ton of carbon dioxide. So if we are enrolling forest in Pennsylvania, you need to pay about $70 per ton of carbon dioxide to get the same amount of return if you had followed the baseline or the current practice. Whereas afforestation, the carbon prices were they demanded much lower carbon prices, restocking about $50. And portfolio, even though it was negative, so it has a $20 per ton price, meaning that if we do all of this combined, instead of just extending rotation, the payment for carbon decreases significantly. So which means that doing different management activities for carbon sequestration is better than just extending rotation. And then obviously timber stand, reduced diameter limit cut, controlled deer browse, and silver pasture, they were already in positive than the baseline at even $5. So they don't need a lot of carbon payments. The story is a bit different in Maryland, where with extended rotation, the demand is only about $30 per ton of carbon. In afforestation, $5. In portfolio, about $15. And then reduced diameter limit cut, about $20 per ton of carbon. What this tells me is the price of the carbon depends on how robust the forest product industry is. If like in Maryland, Pennsylvania or Michigan, if they have a robust forest product industry, the carbon price has to be higher to compensate for the loss due to extended rotation or other management activities for forest carbon management. Whereas if they have a less less robust forest product industries, then lower carbon payment can yield the same net present value or economic return as what is happening in the business as usual scenario. So
Got about, oh, good. Okay, sorry,
some
I've got one more minute.
yeah, some key takeaways is extended or altered rotation negatively affect economics of forest management, silvopasture development, control deer browse, and hopefully we didn't run. So some activities to reduce insects and disease can produce carbon as well as economic return at lower payment for carbon. Afforestation and restructuring works well when there is payment for carbon with lower leakage rates. So I didn't talk about leakage. So if it does not leak much, then they work. If it leaks a lot, or if you manage forest here and then harvest somewhere else, this does not work much. TSI and reduced diameter limit cut can provide economic as well as carbon benefits when done right. And then states with robust forestry sector needs higher payment compared to states with less robust forest product industry. So with that, I would like to conclude. So if you want to look at the trade-off of extending rotation on your land, we have a tool which is under development, which should work with this link, and it should be in the chat as well. But only 10 people can work with this tool at one time. So if it does not work, please try later. Thank you.
Thanks, Raju. Okay, Tammy, not least, just last in line, because you are representing some of the views of those non-industrial forest landowners and the situation they are facing. Oh, you're on mute too.
Can you hear me now?
I do.
Okay, great. Can you see everything okay?
Yes.
Fabulous. Thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. Tammy Cushing. I'm an extension assistant professor in forest business here at the University of Florida. What I'd like to talk a little bit about is more at the landowner level. And so I think about kind of how the economics play out for individual landowners. That's not to say that that's the only game in town for people. I know just because I think like that, that most of the landowners that I'm going to run into through my extension responsibilities aren't primarily focused on the economics of it. We know from studies that economics is not the primary consideration, but I would argue that most folks have a limited cash flow to play with. And so they're looking for ways to either increase some of the revenue that's coming onto their property or reduce the expenses associated with management of that property. And so that's kind of the space that I like to play in. So there we go. So when I think about how to approach forestry with an economic lens, there are a few things that I consider, starting with the cash flow question. What are the needs of that landowner as far as how often do they need cash flows? So it's not just the amount, that's an important question, but I think another really important question is how frequently. So if I think about traditional forest management for a small private landowner, they're probably going to have a harvest maybe once or twice in a lifetime. If they're doing traditional forest management, that once or twice means like doing some kind of a intermediate thinning and then maybe a final harvest. And that would be probably in the best case situation here in the South. As we move around the country, get to those longer rotations, we see less of the regularity. So that makes me start saying, well, if I have a landowner who's looking for that more frequent cash flow, what are some opportunities? And I'll hit that in just a second. So then when I think about maybe the tax situation, right? And so that's where I spend a good chunk of my time thinking about how the current tax laws are either helping or hindering forest landowners' ability just to manage their land or just to hold on to it. And so there's rules within that tax code for how we can treat different types of income, how we can handle different types of expenses. And so anything that we do, signing a contract for a conservation easement, getting into a carbon contract, must be thought about in the terms of what it could do to the eligibility for treating income from a harvest for capital gains treatment, right? Does it trigger some change in the ability to do that? Does it stop you from being able to deduct the expenses that are normally incorporated in forest management? And I care about that because of the long-term nature of this asset. And so I want to make sure that I can deduct things as frequently as possible and that anything I do, I'm at least thinking about it. Switching gears within that and thinking about the property tax angle, I know some folks at Michigan State have looked at it. I've looked at it. There's some of the states that their property tax rules, first off, they're requiring management plans. As a forester, I'm great with that. Where things get a little tricky is whether the language in those property tax rules are prohibiting you from doing anything other than harvesting timber at some point. And so when I look at some of the language, it reads that you have to have the intent of harvesting timber. And so if you sign into a long-term carbon contract, have you maybe like disqualified yourself from that property tax program? And that would be a question to think about kind of ahead of time before you sign into programs. So that kind of rolls into what I want to think about on the opportunities. Talking to a forest landowner, there are opportunities for other ways to kind of deal with that regularity question, right? You could get into a conservation easement. So you could donate the easement that could help with some tax benefits. You could sell that easement that could get you some cash flow. But then you could also think about the carbon opportunities, and that's what we've been talking about with this series, right? Is the carbon opportunities. But you don't want to think about those in a vacuum. There are some opportunities to stack these if they're done correctly. But that means thinking about it before you sign paperwork on either of them. And so if you're thinking about maybe doing an easement, think about maybe is carbon in your future at the same time. Because sometimes you need to do one before the other. Sometimes you want to go ahead and put them in place at the same time. And it all has to do with the language in the contract. And then the last thing on that alphabet soup there is non-timber forest products. That's thinking about things like in the South here, pine straw. It could be evergreen decorations that we have in other parts of the country, and how those opportunities are helping with cash flows. So in my brief little bit here, I like to think about what's stopping me every night, like what's keeping me up thinking about where we're at in forestry. You've heard from the other three speakers that these bigger picture issues, how does that boil down to a forest landowner? Well, I'll be honest with you, losing these forestry markets, that's an issue, and it's happening all around the country. We're seeing mills either shutting down a shift or completely shutting down, and so losing some of that market. We're seeing price changes to places that are not doable for forest landowners, where they're getting to the point where they're almost giving away their timber, but they're happy to do it because it's good forest health, but it's not going to be something that allows them to sustain. And so, like I like to think about the flip side. What can I do about that? Well, what we can do about that is diversify, right? Making sure we have different products that we're doing within the property, whether it's different forest products or maybe carbon's the diversification for us. When I think about uncertainty, top on my head today is policy. We have so many uncertainties related to policies that are in place. Right now, tax policy is certainly uncertain. We don't know exactly where we're going to end the year on certain tax provisions. At any point, we could have changes and new provisions are put in place. Regulations are the same way. We could have new regulations that come, some that are taken away. This is a problem in forestry. It's a long-term planning process. I talked to a landowner who puts trees in the ground they may never harvest. And so thinking about what that means from a number of stems that go in the ground, that matters. And so what we can do about that is, make sure we have good science-based information to pass to the policymakers, but then communicated in a way that they can understand.
30 more seconds, Tammy.
Yep. And finally, thinking about this misinformation or lack of information, landowners are hesitant to jump into new things. They don't know, they don't understand. We're not speaking their language. We have to translate it and put it in terms that they get. So that's it for me.
Awesome. Well, we have just a few minutes for a discussion. I don't see any questions yet, but what I want to do with this panel being research oriented, solutions oriented, I have a very broad question, and I'm actually thank you everyone who put down what their research interests were and the questions that, keep them up at night, like Tammy said. And just ask you to briefly just talk about what do you see as a priority, especially in the area of trying to reduce tension between local and global interests? Because, when we're in a market space, we're often just sort of like, what's in it for me, right? And everybody has to take care of themselves. And that's part of the challenge right now, is that, there's a lot of concern about market volatility, equity, these kinds of questions. And so as far as a research priority, what do you think in reducing this tension, helping reduce this tension? What would come off that list that for you? And I think Raju's comment about just how much leakage influences the value of credits, and it also leakage is an equity issue too, is like who is allowed to participate and who is not, and where is that harvesting pressure going? I think that's obviously an area of research that can, in reducing leakage, would be really valuable.
Yeah, I agree with you, Melissa, because there have been a lot of work on additionality and permanence, but there's very less discussion on leakage, because harvest in one place can sequester carbon, but it can induce harvest in other places, or the mill, which has a sustain, may go farther away, which would incur more emission through transporting those wood products. So it negate the benefits of sequestering in one place. So leakage is important, important to, and it has to be quantified. So one other area to look at in research is to look at like different management activities. This just the work we did is like tip of an iceberg, where there are so many other management activities that you can do to get co-benefits
Climate
of
benefits.
wood products and carbon, and then we have not done it because it's much easier to account additionality and permanence through extended rotation than going through timber stand improvement, because you have to do it right, or creating silvopastures, or managing for invasive species, because it's not that easy. It needs a lot of
No.
modeling. It needs a lot of things to do that.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Anyone else have a comment on a priority?
So maybe I will jump in. I saw the question about the impact of um, administration, administration executive order on the market, voluntary or compliance. So I think that goes back to how that affects the behavior or attitude of people, or those people who buy carbon credits. In reality, since this is a voluntary market where you don't have to do anything, you are buying credits so that you can do a good job, or you can do something better for the planet, or for your as a bequest value for your offsprings. Uh, in theory, so it's the the executive orders or the regulations should not affect it, but these things affects the behavior of people, the way people think, and
That's
the
all
willingness to,
economics, man.
yeah, the willingness to enroll into that. So I think human dimension side becomes very important going forward, and looking at from that perspective on how the attitudes and behaviors have shifted over time uh, towards carbon programs
Social
and carbon
will,
credits. Yeah.
right, towards whether or not we should be putting our forests into climate solutions and how that might look.
Yes.
Well, I think we're out of time. We had such great contributions. We didn't have a lot of time for discussion, but I think that the upcoming paper that comes from this is definitely going to explore these research questions moving forward. I'll hand it off to Chad here.
Yeah, I'll just add real quick that if you're interested in leakage, if you scan the bottom QR code, we had a webinar panel about 2 months ago that covered leakage and research questions related to that. So we had some great folks there discussing some ongoing research and kind of where that field is at and how we try to estimate those things. In the chat as well, there's a link to view some of those previous webinars. And I would just like to highlight our sixth and final webinar coming up in June 17th that will be talking about the social and ecological impacts of forest carbon offsets. Obviously, we're talking a lot about the science related to carbon accounting, how we do monitoring and verification, but we also need to take a moment, step back and think about what are also those broader implications of enacting various policy and economic principles related to combating climate change and trying to address the climate crisis. And so please sign up for our listserv. Please sign up for the upcoming webinar. And before we head out, I'd just like to say thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you for sharing some of the work you have going on and some of the kind of research questions to maybe push the needle a little bit further about how do we support the integrity of carbon credits and make sure that they're the kind of the best public good that we can receive from them. So thank you everybody for attending. I hope everybody has a great afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you, Chad. Thank you, panelists.